My Bible is open to Psalm 5. That will be our text this evening. Psalm 5. We will be there in just a moment. I did imagine a little bit this morning as we were working on Plugged In Part 2 that last Sunday, as I announced we'd be working on that this Sunday, that when we did that this morning, there was a wondering that, well, what does that mean we're going to do tonight? Well, Psalm 5 is where we are going to be this evening. We'll get into that here in just a moment. So good that we get to be together again this evening. It's a blessing to worship our God together, regardless of what the day looks like outside. It's always a beautiful day when we get to worship our God with one another. But boy, it has really turned into a beautiful, sunshiny day. And it's just so good when we get to be together on a day like this. As we get into Psalm 5 this evening, I really struggled with trying to title this lesson. There are several different things that we're going to be discussing inside of this psalm. You will notice as you read the psalm, there are clean divisions in the verses, as the author, who the title attributes to David, that he discusses this is what the righteous looks like. This is what the wicked looks like. And he takes these descriptions and God's relationship with them back and forth. And the psalm breaks up cleanly in this way. So in some sense, what we're looking at this evening is the righteous opposed to the wicked. And we will be thinking about some of that this evening. But we want to recognize as well, this is a prayer, and it's set forward as prayer for these words to be carried to the ears of God. And we'll see that as we work our way through this psalm together this evening. And so I finally settled upon just calling this a prayer of the righteous. And we'll be able to bring all of these things that we discussed there out inside of this psalm. And so with that, let's go ahead and get into it and consider these first three verses together. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God. For to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. Here, stepping into this psalm, David opens it up with a number of phrases here, asking God to give him attention, asking God to give heed to what he is saying here as he asks God, give ear to what I am bringing to your throne here. Open up your ears to me. Consider what it is I have to say to you. You remember when we were going through our Hebrew study and we were told to consider Jesus, and we pointed out there, hey, that's not just Jesus just kind of randomly crosses our thoughts, and that's considering Jesus. No, we pointed out in that context that consider is so much more. Consider is to think deeply about. We'll bring that right back here. Says he's asking God, think about what I am bringing before you. Consider these things. And finally, he uses that phrasing, give attention to my pleas that are coming before you. I like the word one brother uses in describing all of these phrases where he says, there's a sense of urgency in what David is doing here. He makes the point that sometimes we grow accustomed, we grow routine in our prayers, that prayer is something, okay, we're all sitting around the dinner table and it's Thank you, God, for this food. Dear God, please bless this food. Amen. And that's the end of our prayer. And we move into it and out of it so fast that thinking about, God, God, I need you to listen to these words. God, I have to bring my heart to you. Won't you please open up your ears so that you can hear this? My heart has to be made known to you. It's not just this routine thing. It's not just this, okay, we're in it, we're out of it, and then it's done with. No, there's a sense of urgency in David's prayer here that he would have his heart be made known to God, and not merely that he makes his heart known, but that the knowing of his heart is heard. And so he comes to God with this urgency, and he says, give ear to me. Consider me. Give attention to these things that I am bringing before you, bringing us to recognize this in the text in verse 2. David does not just merely refer to God here as God and King. See those words he puts in front of it? My King. My God. David says, I have a personal relationship with you. I am coming to you. I am making my heart known to you. I plead that you will give ear to my voice. You are my God. For him to merely say you are the God, you are the King, would not be incorrect. It would not be wrong, but it would be just a statement of fact. It is factually true. He is God. It is factually true. He is King. But David takes that fact and he applies it to his life. He says, it's not just true that you are king. It's not just true that you are God. You are my king. You are my God. We have a relationship with one another. And I bring these things before you. I want us to see in verse 3 the persistence that he displays. You see that terminology, in the morning? Twice he says it inside of this verse. We can bring the urgency out in this, in which we see and we recognize the point being made. I'll tell you what, he's not waiting until the very end of the day before he makes his heart known to God. So that urgency comes to the forefront once more. But recognize his persistence, that as we read this terminology in the morning, he's not saying, there was one morning at one point in time I voiced my heart to you. No, he says, I am making my prayer known to you in the morning. And the next day, I am making my prayer known to you in the morning. And the next day, I'm making my prayer known to you in the morning. That David continuously brings himself to God in prayer. He maintains this persistence, taking our minds to the New Testament, where Jesus teaches this very thing, for us to be consistent in prayer, for us to continuously bring ourselves to him in this way. And we need to recognize one final thing in what is set before us in concerning this righteous demeanor of an approach to God here. David is expectant for an answer. The ESV uses the terminology of sacrifice Most other translations that I looked at in verse 3, I know the New American Standard, I believe the New King James as well, and there were several others, they did not use sacrifice language. They use prayer language that is talking about the giving of his voice and then the offering of prayer. In that sacrifice language, certainly we can make application as we talk about the fruit of our lips, Hebrews 13, coming to God's ear, being a pleasing sacrifice to him. But the better translation does seem to be the ones that would render this along the lines of David talking about praying and lifting his voice up to God. But here is the point I want to drive home in his expectation. When we come to the ending term there, I have quoted from the New American Standard, I eagerly watch. I lift up my prayer to you, and now I am on the lookout. The New King James putting this as, and I look up, that's okay, but it's not the total ideal of the word. The ideal that he's trying to drive home here is not just, he's gazing into the heavens, I look up. No, the ideal is, I'm looking for your answer. I am sitting and watching and waiting that as I have offered up my prayer to you, as I have made these things known to you, as I have this relationship with you, as I bring these things to you persistently, now I'm eagerly watching. And I know that you will answer me. To recognize this demeanor, to recognize this attitude in carrying ourselves to God with this demeanor, and to know that our God listens to us, to have this urgency in the making ourselves known to him and that he would listen to us, to know that we do have relationship with him. And that he answers because he cares about us. And I think that's just such an excellent start to this psalm, looking at this prayer of the righteous. And to know that we are able to do this because there are some who can't. There are some that God will not hear. Let there be some plea of his opening his ears. But God does not hear the wicked. Let's read verses 4 through 6 here. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. Just going to pull up each of those that we looked at one by one here. First part of verse 4, God does not delight in wickedness. Evil cannot dwell with him. The boastful cannot stand before his eyes. He hates all evildoers. He destroys those who speak lies, and he abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. When God looks at unrighteousness, when God looks at wickedness, he says, I will have absolutely nothing to do with it. It will have absolutely nothing to do with me. There will be a complete and total separation between it and me. I do not delight in it in any form or fashion. It cannot live with me in any form or fashion. In fact, it cannot even stand before my eyes. It will be made to fall. I hate all evildoers, and I will have nothing to do with it. In fact, I will bring my destruction upon it. There are a few things for us to see inside of this. One, what I had the screen titled, where it's made clear. David opens up the psalm. He says, I am bringing my heart to you, and I'm watching for your answer, because I know that you will answer me. And he connects that with that for clause, for those that God will not hear. He says, here are some who you are against, and I know you will not hear them. But there are a couple of other things we need to see inside of this as well. One, we need to see the severity of sin. We need to see how dark sin is. We need to see how wicked sin is. We need to see how deadly sin is. Sometimes we can run in two extremes and fail to recognize a truth. On one side, we can preach the deadliness, the darkness, and the abhorrence of sin, and pretend like there's just no delight in it at all, that there's no pleasure to be had in it. And when we preach it in that way, when the pleasure in it's recognized and taken part of, the person, oh, it's not as bad as that they made it seem. Then we can take hold of the pleasure and come to the other side and say, oh, there's tons of pleasure in it. Oh, yeah, there's tons of feel good in it, and then fail to show it's deadly. It's abhorrent. It's wicked, and it's dark. And I tell you what, we do need to see both of those elements. Both of them need to be brought right to the forefront, because both of them are really true. There is pleasure to be had in sin. Fleeting pleasure, we know from Hebrews, but there's pleasure to be had in it. But in that pleasure, it's dark, it's deadly, it's abhorrent, and in its severity, let us see right here, it cuts us off from God. It cuts us off from all that is good. Do we feel it right in that moment? Maybe not. Does it happen? Absolutely. Sin cuts us off from God, and I do hope that these few verses here will show us the severity of sin. But I want to see one more thing inside of this. I want to see that God doesn't ignore sin. God sees sin exactly for what sin is. God recognizes its abhorrence. In fact, He is the one who abhors it and hates all evildoers. God hates sin. Sometimes we can look out at this world and say, man, look at all this stuff that's going on. God's just kind of ignoring what's going on, isn't He? God isn't ignoring sin. God does not ignore sin is or what sin does. Whether He takes action right in that moment is up to Him, but He's not ignoring it. He recognizes sin for what it is and what it does, and we'll bring that thought back in just a little bit, but I want us to see all of that happening in these verses here as we recognize God's relationship with wickedness, with sin. But with that, let's move into verses 7 and 8, where we will look once more back at the righteous. But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. It says, the righteous can approach. I will come into your house. Why will I come into your house? Through what will I come into your house? David sets forth, it's not because I am just so holy, righteous. I'll tell you what, I'm just perfect. And that's why I'm able to approach you and they can't. You see what he says? Why he is able to approach? Through the abundance of your steadfast love. I do like the New King James on this one. In the multitude of your mercy. It says, as I would give myself to you, as I would depart from wickedness that would separate me from you, in your mercy you would permit me to bring myself to you. In your mercy you would permit me to come unto you in your house. The righteous can approach God, not because they're righteous in and of themselves. They've just done enough good deeds that it outweighs the bad, or they've never done an act of unrighteousness. But no, in the steadfast love and the mercy of God, as one would draw unto God and God would draw unto them, borrowing from the language of James, to cleanse our hands and purify our hearts. And that love, in that mercy, God says, you can approach. I will have relationship with you. Let's bring further in this demeanor of why the righteous can approach God. As he says, I will come and I will, in fear, in reverence, I will worship you. I'm going to draw near in worship. I'm going to draw near in praise because I recognize you as God. I recognize you exactly who you are as God. I will revere you as God. I will fear you as God. And in this recognition of who you are, I will, to use the word again, worship you as God, that we might walk in relationship. You as, go back to verse 2, you as my King and my God, that we have this relationship. And then we come to verse 8, where he says, lead me in your righteousness, O Lord, because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. We recognize the righteousness or the righteous ability to approach God because the righteous say, lead me in your way. The righteous say, I want to walk your paths, Lord. Not my own path, not my own choice, not what would be pleasing to me. What is pleasing to you, you lead me in that way. Now, David says something really interesting in this verse, and I really puzzled over it for a long time before I finally figured out what I think he means here. As he talks about God leading him in righteousness, he says, because of my enemies. Why would he ask God to lead him in righteousness because of his enemies? I think there are a couple of things that David may mean, both of which are fitting inside of this psalm. The psalm is going to end with his talking about God's favor as a shield around the righteous. And so if he would walk with God and have God's favor as a shield around him, he may be saying, lead me in your ways so that I will be shielded from my enemies, so that I will be protected from them. In the life of David, talking about some physical protection there in his walking with God. However, I want to note in verse 9 that there is a connection to the wicked as David says this, lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Look at verse 9. For there is no truth in their mouths. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. I think this may be what David means. Lord, lead me in your ways. You make my path straight. Because my enemies that surround me, I tell you what, they're going to try to deceive me. My enemies that surround me, they will try to flatter me with their tongues, and they're going to try to get me off course because they are seeking my destruction. And so they're going to try to get me away from you with all of their deception. Help me to not be deceived. Help me to not be led away. You keep me on your path. You keep me in your way. You lead me in righteousness so that these enemies who surround me will not come in, will not deceive me, will not lead me away, which will ultimately end in my destruction. And boy, don't we need to be praying that. The righteous need to approach God with this thought. We can approach God with this thought, to ask him to lead us in his righteousness, because this world around us would deceive us. This world around us would have us walk away from our God, and to do that is destruction. To do that is condemnation. So let it ever be our prayer for our God to lead us in his righteousness. And as that is our prayer, as we are walking with him, we can bring this prayer to him. We can bring our hearts to him and know that he listens and know that he answers. But with that, let's move back into verse 9 and carry this into verse 10. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out, for they have rebelled against you. As we just brought forth, the overall idea of verse 9 is that their mouths are deceptive and their hearts are set on destruction. He uses a number of phrases and images to convey this thought, my favorite of which is to call their throat an open grave. You can just kind of imagine the body that isn't buried and it is rotting there, and so all of that death and that decay that is occurring, and that's their throats. That's what's happening inside of them, coming from their hearts, coming from their inward self that is set upon destruction. You can't trust what they say. They are full of deceit. They are full of deception. They are full of destruction. And you can't put your faith in it one little bit, because they're going to walk you down the wrong path. They are full of this corruption. Paul quotes from this verse in Romans 3 and verse 13 as he is setting forth his case that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's not one that is righteous, and he quotes from this in a series of quotations in Romans 3 where he's shown everybody is not righteous. God has to set forth righteousness so that we can be righteous and have this approach. But he's showing that on the whole here, you look at unrighteousness. On the whole here, you look at corruption and those who would be rebellious against God. And as David looks at these people, he says, God, you bring your judgment against them. As they would rebel against you, you make them bear their guilt and fall by their own counsels. Once more, I think that this phrasing is extraordinarily interesting, where David isn't talking about the final judgment here. He could be, and we may ultimately talk about God's dealing justice against those who are unrighteous in the final judgment. But the thought that David puts forward here is he says, as these peoples are given over to wickedness, as these peoples are guilty of deceit and bloodthirstiness, as these peoples are given over to the thought of how they can overcome someone so that they can be on top, as these peoples are guilty of various plottings, as you see that within them, God, make them bear the guilt of their sin, and the result of that therefore being that they would fall by their own counsels, as they would act in an ungodly way. May in that action they fall. You remember in our discussions as we're going through the minor prophets, we made the point how as one departs further and further from ungodliness, or from godliness rather, toward ungodliness, the result of that action as you step away from godliness toward ungodliness, the result of that becomes a crumbling. The result of that becomes a selfish, prideful peoples who make it all about them. And if I'm selfish and prideful and it's all about me, and you're selfish and prideful and it's all about you, and we're all out to get each other, what happens? Well, as I'm scheming and conniving, and you're scheming and conniving, the result of the departure from godliness toward ungodliness is the falling, the crumbling. And that's what David says here. Says, as they act that way, as they are guilty of these things, in your judgment, God, in your providence, make them bear the weight of that guilt. Make them fall by their own counsels, because they're not walking in your way. They are not given over to you. The end of the verse. They have rebelled against you. They would have nothing to do with you. They are corrupt. They are the throat that is an open grave, mouths full of deceit, and hearts set on destruction. So as they act this way, may your judgment come upon them, and they fall by their own counsel. We come then to the last part of the psalm in verses 11 and 12. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. Here are a group of peoples who are opposed to you. Here are a group of peoples who have rebelled against you. But in contrast, here are the righteous. They are not like those who are wicked, and you will bring your judgment against, and they will fall. They are those who take refuge in you. They are those who look to you for protection. So as you protect them, let them rejoice. And let them joyously sing. Let them sing for joy as they find relationship with you. Go back to verse 2 again. My God and my King, as there is this relationship, God hears our bringing our hearts to him. As there is the blessing of relationship with him, what does that bring? You read the book of Philippians. It brings joy. It brings rejoicing that we would have this relationship with our God, that whatever life wants to throw at us, we take our refuge, we take our place of safety with him, because God protects those who are his. God defends those who are his. I want you to notice the reason that happens. The verse ends in verse 11, so that we can exalt in him. So that we can be lifted up in him, and we can lift him up, so that we can praise him. Our God shows his goodness, his mercy, his love to us, so that we can, as we saw earlier, approach him. As we walk in relationship with him and he protects us, we exalt in him. We exalt in his name, bringing us to that final verse then. He blesses the righteous. How powerful is that? You look at the cursing of God against the wicked, where he says, the wicked will fall. The wicked have no relationship with the God who brings these blessings. But those who have a relationship with him, the righteous, God blesses them and shields them with his favor. That is the language used there at the end of the verse. You cover him with favor as with a shield. There's this encompassing, this protective cover of our God's favor. This is his protection. Now, I did point out a little bit earlier in the life of David, and very likely talking about literal physical protection. But as we take this and we make some application here, we can be, in some circumstances, not to limit or hinder the providence of God in the slightest, we could be talking about some physical protection. But to take from the wisdom of the three Hebrew youths who were about to be thrown into the fiery furnace, who said, our God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow down and worship the image. God absolutely can deliver physically, but it's not necessarily that he will. But he always delivers spiritually, that we are able to stand. He always protects those that are his, so that we can use the language of John 10 and Jesus, the Good Shepherd, that as we are in his hands, there is no one who is able to come and snatch us from him. We can use the language of Ephesians 6 as we talk about putting on the armor of God so that we can overcome the schemes of our enemy, the devil, and put to a stop to as we carry the shield of our God, his fiery darts, that our enemy does not overcome us. And we think about God's blessing on those who would walk with him, and it's marvelous. It is wonderful. And I sure hope we see that being set forth inside of this psalm, that this is a blessing that we have as we walk with our God and recognize him for who he is and have this relationship with him. So we bring these things to a close this evening. We're getting ready to sing the song, Do You Know My Jesus? As we sing that together here, I want you to think of that in these terms. Are you in relationship with my Jesus? Are you walking with God in him so that you can be partaker of the blessings that we've just talked about in Psalm 5? When we sing that song, do you know him in that way? Or are you walking away from God? You don't know my Jesus. You don't know the blessings that our God has given to us in him. Won't you repent? Come to know my Jesus. Come to walk with him so that you will know these blessings. If there is anything at all that we can do to help you with that this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing the song selected? Have you